Going to hand this over to Rebecca, who's the program officer at the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. And take it away, Rebecca.
All right, thank you. So in just a second here, I'm going to share my screen and get started with the presentation. As for my background, I have a master's degree in Russian politics and society from King's College London. I have another master's degree in conflict resolution and one more master's degree in conflict resolution and Mediterranean security. I lived in Russia for about 1.5 years while I was doing one of my master's degrees, and worked on and off in Ukraine from 2016 to 2018. So those are my credentials. I am not here on behalf of USCRI, so all of my opinions and statements are my own. Go ahead and bear with me while I get this set up. All right, and I'm just going to check in. Are you able to see me, Amy? And the shared screen?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Okay, so I will get started. So the title of this presentation is Ukraine, How We Got to Where We Are. And we're going to talk about the history of the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. We'll also go into some conflict analysis, some of the reality that's on the ground over in Ukraine, and I'll explain some of the different players that are currently involved in the conflict. So first, I just want to do a quick terminology check. First is why Ukraine instead of the Ukraine. So the term the Ukraine is a remnant of the Soviet Union. Ukraine in its native language means the country or the borderland, and it was referred to during the Soviet era as part of the Soviet Union, as the Ukraine, rather than as an independent country. So Ukraine without the is now correct, and it's understandably very sensitive for Ukrainians in order to avoid implying that Ukraine is still just a part of the Soviet Union or a part of Russia. The second is why Kiev with the YI instead of what you would see in most news articles as an IE, K-I-E-V. So in Ukraine, there are two dominant languages. There's Ukrainian and there's Russian. In Eastern Ukraine, many people speak only Russian, but across Ukraine as a whole, most people speak both. The Russian word for Kiev, written in English, is K-I-E-V, and it's pronounced Kiev. The Ukrainian word written in English is Kyiv with a Y-I. Both of them are technically correct, but Kiev is the Russian term for the city and Kyiv is the Ukrainian one. So as we're going through the presentation and you're seeing this city, this K-Y-I-V, it's the same city as Kiev. All right, so we're going to go way back and just do a few quick facts. So at the core of the debate about which country is real is an empire that was called Kievan Rus, and this existed from the year 879 to the year 1240. Kievan Rus is claimed by Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia as the root of their society and their culture, as their ancestry. Its capital for the first 3 years was Novgorod in what is now Russia. So if you look at the map on the side and you take a look at those white borders, those represent country borders, contemporary, so right now, country borders. After those 3 years, Kiev, in what is now Ukraine, was the capital for the remaining 358 years that it existed. So Russia and Belarus, both of them took the Rus in their name from Kievan Rus. Ukraine has the capital Kiev, which is the same name that it had back then. So again, drawing your attention to these white lines, these border lines, we can see that Novgorod is in Russia. So this space is Russia, and it's obviously a very tiny sliver of Russia. You can see that almost an entire country is within this black line of the empire as well, and that country is Belarus. So most of Belarus was or is what used to be Kievan Rus. And then we can see Kiev, and maybe a quarter or a third of Ukraine is in what used to be Kievan Rus. So the Russian and Ukrainian languages diverged only after the fall of Kievan Rus. In the 17th century, the Cossack Hetmanate rose. This was the equivalent of a Ukrainian nation state. However, it was then taken and divided between Russia and Poland, and then later taken over completely by Russia alone. Now we're going to get into some of the more recent history, so the 1900s, the 20th century. In 1917, inspired by the Russian Revolution, Central and Eastern Ukrainians broke away and formed the Ukrainian People's Republic after centuries of Russian rule. So Russian rule ever since the fall of that Cossack Hetmanate. In 1922, the Ukrainian People's Republic was forcibly seized by the Russian army and annexed into the Soviet Union. It was then renamed the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. From 1932 to 1933, there was a famine that is known as Holodomor. This was caused by the Russian seizure of Ukrainian grain to feed Moscow and Leningrad, what is now known as St. Petersburg. There are estimates that between 3 and 10 million Ukrainians died in the famine. I would say that the most often cited number is around 7 million, but due to the nature of the famine, it's virtually impossible to get a really accurate estimate of just how many people died. To put this in a little bit more perspective, there was an extremely harsh winter and the infrastructure of the Soviet Union was really falling apart. As a result, the cities of Moscow and St. Petersburg and other smaller cities, but as far as the Soviet Union was concerned, these were the two big problems. They immediately saw a massive food shortage, and Ukraine happens to have the most fertile ground in the world, actually, and was producing massive amounts of grain, as always. So by train, Soviet officials began seizing and evacuating the grain from the territory of Ukraine and into Russia, into what is now Russia, to the cities of St. Petersburg and Moscow. The result is that even though Ukrainian farmers were forced, more or less at gunpoint, to continue farming the land, they were not allowed to keep any of the food or grain that they were able to grow. So they were producing all of the food that got the Soviet Union through this famine, and they had the by far highest number of casualties. This is a massive, massive scar in recent Ukrainian history, and I think probably the first most important event to kind of contextualize the current conflict. In 1939, Poland was divided between Nazi Germany and the USSR, the Soviet Union. What is now Western Ukraine was annexed into the USSR as well. In 1991, Ukraine declared independence during the fall of the Soviet Union, and in 1994, under the Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine agreed to give up all nuclear weaponry in exchange for a guarantee of protection from invasion. So this is kind of the backdrop going into the 2000s. In 2004, there occurred what is known as the Orange Revolution. So Russian President Vladimir Putin assigned his personal election campaign to a man named Viktor Yanukovych. He was a pro-Russian candidate who was running for president in Ukraine. Yanukovych's campaign was based primarily on reestablishing relations with Russia. His opponent was named Viktor Yushchenko, and Viktor Yushchenko, during the campaign process, was poisoned, almost definitely by a member of Yanukovych's own campaign, but if not a member of his campaign directly, then more than likely by a Russian actor who was sent to do it. Miraculously, he survived. However, Yanukovych won the election. The problem was that there was massive, widespread fraud, very similar in type and strategy to the patterns that we see in Russian presidential elections. So, for example, observers weren't allowed to go into the back to observe the ballot counting. It was done completely in secret. And there were counties whose total number of votes was much higher than the number of people who lived there. This is very typical of Russian election fraud patterns and strategies. As a result, a massive protest erupted in Ukraine, known as the Orange Revolution. The election was then held again, but this time under close supervision by many international authorities, and this time Viktor Yushchenko won by a significant margin. It was about 7%. In 2013-2014, there was what's known as Euromaidan, also known as the Maidan Revolution, or the preferred name by Ukrainians is the Revolution of Dignity. So to complicate matters further, Yushchenko, who is the one that was poisoned and then legitimately won the election, was actually not a very well-liked president. He received extremely poor ratings. He performed very poorly. And so at the end of his term, Yanukovych, his original opponent, was elected in earnest. So the opinion of the country kind of flipped. However, at the last minute in the fall of 2013, Yanukovych backed out of a prearranged agreement with the European Union for Ukraine to ascend to the EU to begin that process. Instead, he signed a last-minute massive economic agreement with Putin. Protests once again erupted in Ukraine. They continued on and off through February of 2014. A private police force called the Berkut violently suppressed them, especially in Kiev, with increasing severity. There were approximately 100 people killed during this revolution, and I think it's around 85 of them are estimated to have died between February 18th and February 20th alone. So a massive portion in a very violent few days. The Ukrainian protesters succeeded. Yanukovych fled the country and went to Russia, where he was promptly appointed mayor by Putin. This is going to bring us to the more immediate history prior to this year. So from 2014 to 2021, we see the fallout of the Orange Revolution and the Revolution of Dignity and the beginning of the Russo-Ukrainian War. So immediately after the eviction of Yanukovych, Vladimir Putin moved on Crimea. He sent Russian troops to cut it off from Ukraine and held what was very likely a staged referendum. It's obviously impossible to know unless you were there in a polling booth to know for a fact, because there wasn't allowed to be any news coverage really at the time. However, the reason that it's strongly suspected to have been staged is that, number one, at that time, most of the people of Crimea were more or less on house arrest. They were not very able to leave and navigate around Crimea because of the presence of Russian troops. The second reason is that the number of Crimeans was estimated to have been, by the Russian government, to have been something like 97% of people voted in favor of the referendum, which is an incredibly unrealistic number. And the third reason is that in addition to people not being able to get out and this kind of very, very high number that we were seeing, there were leaked videos of entirely empty polling booths. So Crimea is not very big. There were only so many polling booths to begin with, and the vast majority of them were empty. This indicates that there wasn't really an election going on or a referendum. The new Ukrainian government was outraged, and in response, they outlawed Russian TV and radio, and they made moves to eliminate Russian as a language on official documents and in schools. The problem with this is that in eastern Ukraine, many people only speak Russian. So this was outlawing the only language that they knew and the only language that they had access to. As a result, eastern Ukrainians began protesting on their own. Russia saw a bit of an opportunity there and provided weapons, training, and in some cases military support to separatists groups in Luhansk and Donetsk. The Russo-Ukrainian War officially began. Something that I think the international community misses very often when they're talking about this is the impact that this had not only on the ground in Ukraine, but politically. The Russo-Ukrainian War effectively prevented Ukraine from ascending to the EU or NATO because engagement in ongoing active conflict disqualifies a country from being a candidate. So by maintaining this conflict constantly between Russia and Ukraine, Russia was preventing Ukraine from ever being able to begin the process of joining the EU or NATO. The Minsk Protocol briefly coordinated a ceasefire, but it had collapsed by 2015. Minsk II was marginally more successful, and most of the fighting stopped, but Russian support continued. Approximately 14,000 died in the war prior to 2022, and the vast majority of them died in those first 2 years. After that, the fighting was greatly reduced. I don't think that we could accurately call it a ceasefire. However, it was not active war in the sense that we would usually think about it. I want to do another quick terminology check here. So a security dilemma occurs when one country takes action to increase their security, and that makes another country feel insecure and do the same. This leads to a back and forth style escalation. So an example of this would be if one country began feeling insecure and put, let's say, a whole bunch of nuclear weaponry all along the border shared with another country. The other country would then begin to feel insecure because of this, and they may put all of the same amount of weaponry along with 20,000 soldiers. In response, the other country now adds 50,000 soldiers and an even bigger weapon. So we can see how this begins to just go up and up and up. Ukraine was utilized by NATO and the EU in the ongoing security dilemma between Europe and Russia. This escalated relations over a period of years. It's a very kind of complex dynamic that they had here, because this security dilemma very likely did keep the Russian invasion of Ukraine at bay, as in it made it more difficult for Russia to just immediately invade Ukraine. However, because of the nonstop heightening and escalating of relations, it more or less ensured that the invasion would happen eventually. In 2020, President Trump withheld arms from Ukraine unless Zelensky agreed to publicly investigate the Biden family. And when Zelensky refused involvement, Ukrainian aid was cut. This created kind of a brief window, so to speak, because Ukrainian military power and ability to provide aid, for example, was significantly lower than what had originally been anticipated. During this time, Ukraine became increasingly more desperate and more anxious to join both the EU and NATO in order to ensure protection from Russia. And the EU and NATO became slowly more amiable to the idea. There began to be some public statements that indicated that they may be willing to make an exception for Ukraine to join despite the ongoing conflict. And understandably, that is more or less the last significant development prior to what has occurred this year. So afraid that Ukraine's ascension to NATO and the EU was imminent, Putin planned to frame Ukraine for brutality to justify invasion. US intelligence managed to more or less stay ahead of this and began publicly outing Russia's plans as they came. So this delayed the Russian invasion. However, on February 24th, Putin had officially lost patience. He abandoned this justification that he had been planning and invaded Ukraine with a plan to have seized Kiev, assassinated Zelensky, and assumed control over the Ukrainian government by the end of the second day. On February 26th, the Ukrainian president informed his advisors that it was very likely to be the last day that they would see him alive. The response to this obviously was extremely strong. And although I don't think that a single sentence, can make or break the response in a conflict, I think that this is an extremely significant turning point. By February 27th, Zelensky was still alive. Ukrainian troops had massively rallied. Russia's planned overtake of Kiev had failed at this point, at least per its original timeline, due to Ukrainian military defense tactic and supply chain problems for Russian military forces. Ukrainian morale soared and international aid began pouring in as countries that had previously more or less written Ukraine off began to realize that, they were kind of putting up a bit of a fight. They stood a fighting chance, and that they were, as horrible as it is to say, a worthy investment when it comes to international politics. That is unfortunately exactly how it was viewed. So February 28th, the first round of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine occurred. The main objective, aside from negotiating a ceasefire, was to be able to create a humanitarian corridor in many of the Ukrainian cities that were under nonstop attack. March 8th, the first and thus far only successful humanitarian corridor was established, and it evacuated 3,500 citizens out of the city of Sumy. I'm going to go into the cities pretty shortly here, but Sumy is one of the cities that is very hard hit, and it's near the Russian border. On March 18th, the number of refugees hit 3.3 million, and the number of internally displaced in Ukraine hit 6.9 million. So I first want to address a couple of questions that I have been asked before. Number one is, should we be skeptical of what we're seeing? And number two is, should we be horrified? I do think that a little bit of skepticism is healthy during any conflict. So not every single report will be true. Some will be intentionally false. Some will be accidentally false. But in the case of Ukraine, the sheer number of news sources makes it a lot easier to find accurate information. We can confidently state a few things as fact. Number one is that civilians and aid workers are being targeted by Russian military forces. Number two is that there have been thousands of Ukrainian civilian deaths and thousands of military deaths as well. Number three, there have been more Russian soldier deaths than Ukrainian deaths. This is becoming a little bit more difficult to determine because of the city of Mariupol, which I will also get to pretty shortly here. The city of Mariupol has seen massive casualties that as of right now are virtually impossible to confirm because of the sheer condition of the city. Approximately 80 to 90% of it has been destroyed. Prior to this incredibly aggressive recent shelling, the number of Russian soldier deaths was very likely to be greater than the total Ukrainian soldier and civilian deaths combined. Now there's some question being called in because although there has been a huge number of Russian soldier deaths, I believe it's 17,000 now, it's very possible that the city of Mariupol alone has seen more deaths than that. Number four, Russian soldiers are in some cases intentionally sabotaging their own operations to avoid fighting. And number five, all reference to the war in Russia, the use of the word war to refer to this special military operation, is currently punishable by prison time to the tune of up to 15 years. There have been thousands of arrests in Russia, thousands who have been put on home detention. The fines are going up into the thousands, and it only seems to be getting harsher, the punishment that the Russian government is instituting. So here we have some numbers. 3,300,000 refugees have fled Ukraine, mostly women and children. It's estimated to be around 3,600,000 now, but 3.3 million is the most recently confirmed number. 1,100 missiles fired at Ukraine since February 24th. Again, this number has likely gone up because it has stayed the same in terms of like official count for about 2 weeks now. They have not released an updated confirmed number, but it could very well be significantly more than that by now. 3,000 plus civilian deaths. That plus is a giant question mark right now. For sure, there are more than 3,000 civilian deaths. For sure, there are more than 3,000 civilian deaths in the city of Mariupol alone. But again, it is so difficult right now for anybody to even try to begin the counting process to determine who has survived, who's in hiding, who's trapped, who has died. All right, so we're going to take a look now at a map. So you'll see there are 6 cities on this map, and I'm going to describe a bit the very different circumstances that these 6 cities are under. But I'm first going to just very quickly address the countries that are surrounding Ukraine. So we can see to the east and northeast Russia. Obviously, Russia was in the Soviet Union as well. We can also see Belarus directly north of Ukraine. Belarus was also a part of the Soviet Union and to this day maintains extremely close relations with Russia. In fact, the Belarusian government is, we could say, almost 100% dependent economically on Russia. Its debt far outweighs anything that it would be able to repay anytime soon. And the president of Belarus is a very close, maybe friend would be a wrong word, but a very close associate of the Russian president, Vladimir Putin. If we go to the west, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, and Romania. These 4 countries are all EU countries. And the last one, if you see underneath Ukraine, is Moldova. So Moldova is kind of a unique country in the sense that it's actually in a very similar position as Ukraine. So Moldova was previously part of the Soviet Union. It broke away with the fall of the Soviet Union. However, there is a portion of Moldova, it's known as a frozen conflict, because nothing is really happening, but it hasn't been resolved. It's called Transnistria, and Transnistria is Russian supported and under occupation by what are, I guess we could say, Russian sympathizing or Russian identifying separatists, quite similar to what we saw in Eastern Ukraine. So these are the countries that are around Ukraine. I think next we'll start off with the cities that are within Ukraine. We'll start with Kiev. Kiev obviously is right there smack in the center. It is quite close, really comparatively, to the Belarusian border. Kiev is significant for several reasons. Number one, obviously, it's the biggest city in Ukraine. It's also the capital of Ukraine. Most of the city of Kiev is intact right now, and the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, remains in Kiev. However, stores have run out or are running out of things like drinkable water, for example, because while supplies have not been cut off, they have been dramatically reduced. Missiles have managed to hit several buildings, including several residential buildings, and several other missiles have been deflected. One in particular is a missile that was aimed at the riverbank outside of Kiev. If this missile had hit, it would have kicked up massive amounts of radioactive sediment that had settled after the Chernobyl disaster. This would have had the potential to kick up a cloud into the air, a radioactive cloud, very similar to the original Chernobyl disaster and the cloud that resulted. It would have had the potential to float across Europe, causing radioactive damage to far more than just Ukraine. There do remain some Russian infiltrators in the streets of Kiev. These are people who were placed ahead of the invasion specifically to kind of assist from the inside. So there is some fighting in the streets. Many people do still spend all day and night in bunkers in metro stations due to the nonstop air raid sirens. And although the Russian line of tanks outside of it that was very prominently featured in the news has largely stalled, they're not very far outside of the city. I want to say about 9 miles. Absent a negotiated solution, Kiev will eventually fall under a much more active attack. The next city that I want to talk about is the city of Kharkiv. So if you follow Kiev in a line all the way over to the east, Kharkiv is the second largest city in Ukraine after Kiev, and as we can see, it's very close to the Russian border. This is also where the vast majority of the images that we're seeing in the media are coming from. It is under a nonstop onslaught, shelling, missiles, bombing, you name it, from Russian forces. There has been massive infrastructural damage. People there are largely trapped, similarly to in some of the other cities in Ukraine that are being quite harshly attacked right now. Despite repeated negotiations and assurances from Russian forces, they have not been able to establish a humanitarian corridor out of Kharkiv yet. Russians have not taken the city yet, but they're fighting very hard for it. Part of the reason for this is that strategically, it is very important to them. It is by far the largest city of its type and of its size that is that close to Eastern Ukraine. It also has a very functional, large international airport. And again, as you see, it's very close to the Russian border, which makes it easy to run supplies to. The current Russian strategy when it comes to Kharkiv and also for Mariupol could probably be considered similar to the infamous Russian scorched earth policy. That is, if they can't take it, they mean to destroy it or make it unusable to anybody outside of themselves. We're going to go all the way back over to the west now, to the city of Lviv, that is very close to the Polish border. It is currently acting as a hub for most of the internally displaced people within Ukraine and also for refugees. So Western Ukraine is under significantly less attack than the rest of the country, than Central, Eastern, and Northern Ukraine. One of the reasons for this, obviously, is its proximity to the EU. Russia doesn't, at least at this point, want to risk accidentally sending a missile too close to the Polish border, for example. However, Lviv has not been entirely unscathed. A military outpost was blown up during a brief offensive on a lot of Western Ukraine. 35 were killed in it. There are air raid sirens that occur in Lviv, and there have, of course, been significant threats to it. When I say internally displaced people, what I mean are people who have been forced to flee their cities but don't want to leave Ukraine or cannot leave Ukraine. There's a significant number of people who had to flee for their own safety but are not willing to exit their home country. For people who do want to leave, however, Lviv runs buses kind of all day at this point, back and forth from Poland and also to other places, but the vast majority go into Poland. So that's the current situation in Lviv. The next one that I'm going to talk about is Kherson. So it's the southernmost at the very bottom of the 6 cities that I've marked here. This is a smaller city of less than 300,000 people. It's strategically important to Russia because it is a port city. It's receiving a lot of attention in Ukraine for very brave, spirited citizens who have done things, for example, like knelt in front of Russian tanks to stop them from moving forward in the city. Prior to that, they had thrown bicycles at them because they had, nothing else to try to fight them off with. So it's a significant number of farmers, for example, that live in this town, in this city. And we also see, for the first time, I saw in Western media last night, Kherson in some headlines for similar reasons to what Ukrainians have been talking about them for, which is their massive protests. So the citizens of Kherson are quite famous at this point for staging protests surrounding Russian tanks in their city with, giant flags, or even stepping up on top of the tanks, for example. Another very popular story is the farmers of Kherson went out to the field to begin working the ground even despite the occupation. About a week and a half ago, the Kremlin did claim that they had taken Kherson. This was not the first time that they had claimed this. It may have been the most legitimate one. However, the citizens of Kherson have not conceded, so it remains a little bit vague at this point who we could say really has control over the city. It is definitely Russian occupied. However, it does not seem like the citizens there are willing to peacefully allow that occupation anytime soon. So in my opinion, we can't truly say that it is currently controlled by Russia. The next city is Mariupol. So Mariupol is where the vast majority of the casualties are occurring. As I said earlier, between 80 and 90% of the city has been destroyed at this point. It has been more than 2 weeks now that Mariupol has been completely absent food, water, any type of drinkable water aside from snow that they can melt, and electricity. It is a strategic holdout because it's one of the largest cities in Donetsk. Russian forces are attacking Mariupol indiscriminately at this point. And although 2,500 have been confirmed dead, so out of that 3,000 plus earlier, 2,500 of those 3,000 confirmed dead are in Mariupol alone. However, that number is very likely to be much higher. Even though 2,500 is the confirmed number, the mayor of Mariupol has estimated that it's closer to 20,000. If anybody was following the news, there was a theater that was housing women and children that was bombed, I think about 10 days ago. It was estimated that 1,300 women and children remained buried alive under the rubble. However, rescue attempts were unsuccessful, largely because of the nonstop missile strikes. Nobody could get there to get to them. Similarly, about a week ago, there was a school that was bombed, a very similar scenario. It was estimated that there were 400 that were buried beneath. And although I have not seen them to be presumed dead, it's very likely after this many days that those who were unable to escape on their own will already have perished. I think another thing that people need to understand about Mariupol, and when we say that we know, for example, that Russia is targeting civilians and targeting aid workers. Mariupol, the theater that was bombed, had children written in giant white letters on either side of it. And even more so, the Red Cross has been repeatedly attempting to utilize a supposed humanitarian corridor to bring aid in the form of food and water and medical aid into Mariupol. However, despite the negotiations, Russian forces continued to drop missiles on this area, and in fact blew up the Red Cross outpost, leaving them to abandon their mission. There have been many people in the last week or so that have escaped Mariupol. However, it has not been through a humanitarian corridor. It's been through more or less people just kind of taking their chances at this point. So people who had cars were piling into their cars, as many as they could fit, and just driving out of the city. Some of them did not make it, but many did. There do seem to be some indications that the Russian military avoided targeting those who were fleeing. And the last city is Sumy. So if we go to the northmost and the one that is closest to the Russian border, this is the city of Sumy. In Ukraine, their states are called oblasts, and it is very common for the vast majority of Ukrainian oblasts to be named after their capital city. So in this case, Sumy is the name of both the oblast, the state, and also the city. Sumy is also incredibly hard hit. It was among the first city and region to be completely cut off by Russian forces from the rest of Ukraine, including a nearby city called Konotop, which is also in Sumy Oblast. This is one of the cities that I worked in. Sumy was able to evacuate approximately 3,500 people through a humanitarian corridor, but since then, residents have remained trapped except for those who were willing to attempt escape by themselves. However, there are reports and videos of incredibly disturbing atrocities happening in the Sumy region. So, for example, cars with very clear children sitting in the back being blown up by Russian tanks as they attempt to evacuate. So most citizens are very scared, understandably, and remain trapped in bomb shelters, especially those with children who are unwilling to risk their lives in an attempt to escape. So I think, although this is obviously a very bleak picture, I think it's very important to understand what's going on, on the ground in Ukraine, and also to understand that not every city in Ukraine is facing the same circumstances. In fact, the cities are facing vastly different circumstances depending on where in Ukraine they are and to what degree they are being attacked by Russian forces. So a question that has been on a lot of political speakers' minds, for example, it's been hotly debated, is why wasn't it easy? So the entire world kind of anticipated that it was going to be an easy win for Russia, and that was why it took a few days for aid to even begin being offered to Ukraine. There's a few reasons for this. Number one is that Russian soldiers weren't told that they were invading until just before the invasion began. So for reference, the Russian government, their official statement was that the Russian soldiers were only along the border for practice drills. However, this is the same thing that was told to the Russian soldiers. Many of these soldiers are between the ages of 18 and 22. So they are very young, they're not very highly trained, and up until just before the invasion, they thought that they were there to do practice drills. Many of them are extremely ill-prepared, very frightened, and not at all motivated. The second is that the Ukrainian government did have time to prepare, and Ukrainian morale is very high. Soldiers in Ukraine are exceptionally motivated. Number 3, Ukrainian soldiers offer food and housing to Russians who defect. Some EU countries have begun offering amnesty and asylum to Russian soldiers who refuse to fight. Ukrainians have begun destroying and removing road signs, leaving Russians unable to navigate to their destinations. So Ukrainian roads are notoriously very difficult to navigate, and Ukrainians as a whole tend to have a very innate sense of their land. It's quite difficult to describe it, actually, because I certainly got lost all the time while I was over there. But in Ukraine, outside of major cities, many towns and cities are really quite small, and you have to go down all kinds of long, winding roads to be able to get anywhere. As a result, they're quite used to going down their own roads, and they know where things are on their own, but it's extremely easy for somebody who's not used to it to get lost. There are massive issues with Russian supply chains. Fuel refills get lost or never arrive, and some Russian soldiers are sabotaging their own. So for example, they are stabbing holes into their own fuel tanks. We'll go into that a little bit more later. Second to last, the world did not expect Ukraine to last beyond the first couple of days, and once those days passed, as I said, the world began pouring aid into Ukraine, which is partially sustaining the military. And the last one is that Ukraine has an extremely large and very involved international diaspora that has also poured funding for medical support and military support into Ukraine. Now let's talk about the consequences and the ramifications. So we're going to start with Ukraine. Thousands have died, thousands more are likely to die, including civilians, aid workers, and soldiers. Infrastructure repair costs will be in the billions at the very least, likely to be significantly higher. There are some families who have been separated who are unlikely to be reunited. That's even if the war were to end tomorrow. If Russia takes Kiev, the death of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is likely. He would be replaced by a Russian selected leader, and the dynamic of the war would change. So this is another thing that I see being underrepresented in the news and by columnists. If Zelensky was to be replaced by a Russian selected president, the dynamic of the war would very likely change to closer to a civil war. So where the Ukrainian army or parts of the Ukrainian army were now fighting against their illegitimate leader and the Russian resources and potentially some Ukrainians who backed them. This would make a huge and also kind of catastrophic difference, because there are many countries around the world who are currently contributing aid to Ukraine who have policies in place that prevent them from taking a side during a civil war. So in the event that this occurred, not only would it be a massive blow to Ukraine to lose their president, especially a president who is as renowned and influential as Zelensky is right now, it could potentially also change the amount of assistance that other countries are even capable of providing. Ukraine has lost nearly 7% of its population through fleeing refugees. That's 3.3 million out of a country of 44 million. This number will go up. Many in Donetsk and Luhansk do identify as Ukrainian. So in the event that the war ends with Donetsk and Luhansk being seized by Russia, there would be a second flow of refugees. So Ukrainians in Donetsk and Luhansk who weren't willing to give up a Ukrainian passport would be forced to flee west. I want to clarify here that I don't think that this is a very likely outcome, or at least not a very likely willing outcome. As Russia becomes increasingly more desperate, the ferocity of the attacks will increase. Russia went from what looked to them like an assured victory to what now looks like a likely loss in its current trajectory. The use of chemical weaponry, nuclear reactor sites, and framing Ukrainian soldiers to justify Russian attacks are all potentially imminent. I want to take a minute to address both chemical weaponry and nuclear reactor sites. So there's a term called a false flag, and a false flag is when a country accuses another country of doing something that they are planning to start doing. So again, as Putin's initial plan was to frame Ukraine for all kinds of atrocities, in this case, they have accused Ukraine of utilizing chemical weaponry and bioweaponry. And historically, for Russia, that very strongly indicates that Russian forces are getting ready to use them. As far as nuclear reactor sites, so far Russian forces have accidentally or coincidentally set 3 nuclear reactor sites within Ukraine on fire, including Chernobyl. I personally, and many others, don't think that this is very much of a coincidence at all. There are many reasons for this. However, the most significant one is that if a nuclear reactor site were to explode due to missile fire, for example, it would cause a massive nuclear disaster, quite similar, in fact, to what would happen if you dropped a nuclear weapon. However, Russia wouldn't have to take credit for having attacked with a nuclear weapon. Instead, they would likely frame it as an accidental or unrelated explosion of a nuclear site. So this is an attempt to use nuclear weaponry without having to take responsibility for it. We're going to talk next about the consequences for Russia. So although Putin has utilized mass fraud in elections, it's also true that in every election thus far, he received a genuine majority of votes. So what I mean by that, just to clarify here, is that in an election where, for example, he won 57% of the vote, he would utilize, and his campaign would utilize fraud to make it look like he had won 69% of the vote. So he wasn't using fraud to try to swing an election in his favor. He was using it to make it seem like he was more popular in an election that he was already winning. His popularity now is sharply decreasing among those who have access to information about Ukraine. However, it's increasing among supporters and those who don't. This is unfortunately a massive number of Russians, because in Russia, all news and television is controlled by the state. It's all state media. Again, they've outlawed even just the use of the word war. And as of right now, the narrative that is going on in Russia is that Nazis have made a comeback. They're framing it as like a second bout of World War II. In this case, the Ukrainian government is the Nazi government, the equivalent of the German government in World War II, and Russia is going in to protect other Ukrainians from this Nazi occupation and everything else that comes with it. Second, sanctions and bank cutoffs have crippled the Russian economy, but unfortunately does not really impact Russian military capability. There is still a lot of money in Russia. It's just not in the hands of most Russians, many of whom are now in dire economic situations. So to clarify here, Putin is very strongly suspected to be the most wealthy person in the world. And the oligarchs that surround Putin, many of them are just kind of serving as pockets for his own personal wealth. So a lot of the wealth that they have was either given to them in the form of actual wealth or even just in the form of businesses that he assigned to them to handle. If he wanted to, he would be able to fund huge portions of this war for years to come. And it's also worth noting that the Russian military is already quite well equipped, and that's not just going to disappear anytime soon. What these sanctions really are is a strategy to encourage Russians internally to rebel against Putin. The more dire the circumstances, the theory is that the more likely they are to kind of create an internal revolution and dethrone him, so to speak. This is a very controversial strategy, understandably, but that's where we stand with sanctions. Many who have passports are fleeing Russia. Many others, in the thousands, are protesting and being arrested or detained inside their home. Under increasingly desperate conditions, Putin is likely to behave increasingly more erratically. So one of the things that we have been seeing is that Putin, who is normally known for being very calm, very cold, and very calculated in all of his interviews and all of his statements, is becoming increasingly more frustrated, increasingly more emotional. He is making arguments that abandon kind of the cold sense of logic that he's quite known for using. This makes him even less predictable, obviously, because he's very much cornered at this point. However, this also means more punishment for Russians, more severe attacks on Ukraine, and threats to the international community, so catastrophic consequences that he's been saying repeatedly, which he may or may not follow through with. I recognize that that's a very vague statement. However, when you have somebody who's in a mental place, like the place where Putin is now, a man who is renowned around the world for his control and his power and for being the best person in the world at playing a game of chicken and calling everybody else's bluff, when he is suddenly faced with a situation that I genuinely think he never really considered, it becomes far more likely that he would take more drastic measures. The last one, the consequences for the allyship of Europe and the United States. Poland is currently taking in the vast majority of all refugees. So I mentioned 3.3 million earlier, 1.8 million or more are estimated who have gone into Poland alone. Many of them are then traveling to other locations because right now Ukrainians have free transportation by train all around Europe. In the event that the war does not end quickly, a structure will be put in place to divide refugees up among other European countries, the US and Canada. I know it was in the news today that the United States has agreed to take in 100,000. This isn't really a great example of dividing up the number of refugees because comparatively 100,000 is not very many. However, this is likely to have been the result of two things. Number one being that we hit the 1 month mark, and that means that this conflict just became exponentially more likely to become a long and drawn out conflict. And number two is that the threat of chemical and or nuclear weaponry from Russia became quite a bit more real in the last several days. That kind of creates a shift that makes it much less likely that Ukrainians will all be able to return home in the next few weeks, which is really what a lot of international powers were hoping for. They were hoping to wait for negotiations to occur before they had to make any decisions about this. European and NATO involvement is not impossible if Russia targets a convoy, whether intentionally or unintentionally, fires a missile into EU territory, or uses significant chemical or nuclear weaponry. But absent these conditions, and honestly, possibly even under these conditions, they are likely to continue to refuse to engage. European and US economies will also continue to be damaged due to fractured economic relations with Russia and Belarus and potentially China. However, gas and oil prices will stabilize probably in the next 2 to 7 weeks based on factors independent of the war. During wartime economies, it is extremely common for oil prices and gas prices to rise significantly, even if it's not a war that involves a country that exports oil. This is just a capitalization on, for lack of a better word, on the fear of people and the ability to kind of control economies in that way. When we're dealing with a conflict where the word oil is in the news every single day, it is that much worse. So even though the price of oil is going down, we are seeing gas prices continue to rise. What we are very likely to see is that gas prices will slowly decrease and they will stabilize. However, they will still be higher than they were prior to the invasion, even if the price of oil has gone lower than it was prior to the invasion. So the last slide I have for you is how do we help? Number one is to donate. So Razom for Ukraine is at the forefront of American efforts to provide humanitarian aid to Ukrainians on the ground. They are a long-established and trusted organization with partners in Ukraine. I've worked with Razom for Ukraine in the past. You can find them at razomforukraine.org. I'm also donating all speakers' fees for all the presentations that I'm doing to them. And if you are able to, I encourage you to donate as well. Number two is to remember to treat Russians and Ukrainians kindly. The Ukrainian diaspora in the US is suffering massive trauma. Reach out to your community to ask if you can help. There are often Ukrainian churches in a given community. That's a good place that you can start. Remember not to ostracize or harm Russian people, many of whom are also scared and completely unrelated to what the president of a country that they already left or perhaps never even lived in is doing. For reference politically here, to attack Russians or to try to drive them out would also give Russia a foothold to insist that they must protect their own against aggression. So it would also give Russia a justification that they already don't really need to insist that they have to protect Russian people from the West. And the last one, number 3, is to calmly talk about it. So to spread what you know and talk about it with your friends, with your families. If you're a teacher, talk about it with your students. Use trusted news sources and don't allow your personal fear to dictate your morals or opinions. I know that situations like this can be very scary. And it can be very tempting for people to start saying things like, I feel so bad for Ukrainians, but there's nothing that we can do without risking World War III, for example. And again, it is very much in human nature to begin thinking along those lines. However, something that I think it's important for us to remember here is, number 1, that we are not currently in any danger. So we need to make sure that we're keeping the focus on people who are presently in danger and alleviating their danger, their stress, and ensuring that they come out of this okay. And secondarily, it's also just kind of noting that when we have situations like this, the entire international community is full of diplomats who have been trained for this exact scenario and who are attempting to make as sound decisions as they possibly can. However, of course, public opinion is able to shift those decisions. And when the public begins to panic, it is possible to begin undermining what would otherwise be really sound diplomatic decisions and start encouraging and pressuring them into making decisions that are more likely in the long run to do more harm than good. I am going to open the floor to questions now. If you have any questions, please type them in the chat. I'll use the remaining time to answer them. You can also email me at rebecca.mcgory@gmail.com if you have other questions that I don't get to tonight or that you think of later. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and you're welcome to begin.
Okay, thank you so much, Rebecca, for that very informative presentation. I do have a question already from Gail, who asked earlier in the evening. You spoke of 1,100 missiles, but have there been much more artillery shells as well?
Yeah, so I think even just the number of missiles alone is actually much higher at this point than 1,100. And as for artillery shells are virtually impossible to even keep track of because they come down in such high numbers. So yes, the shells do, I would say, just as much damage, just in smaller bursts. So they're using more artillery shells than they are using missiles. Missiles are having more of an impact when they first land. However, a week's worth of artillery shells are causing just as much decimation.
Okay. And again, if anyone else has any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat and we'll ask them. You would have to type it in if possible. I can see if I can allow, Lynn, can you hear me? You have your hand raised. Are you able to talk? I'm not entirely sure.
I think we can unmute her, maybe.
I think
it says talking permitted.
Yeah. We'll see if, oh, no, maybe she doesn't want to talk. Okay. So I guess I'll ask some questions. So since you obviously volunteered in Ukraine, so how is it for you watching all of this unfold? Just there and knowing people there.
Yeah, it is very difficult. As I'm sure you can imagine. I'm trying to focus more on them than on myself because obviously I know that, while it's very stressful for me and very emotional and upsetting for me, it doesn't compare to actually being there, in the moment. I do have friends, former colleagues that have been forced to leave the country. I have others that have just been forced to leave their home, and a much higher number that I don't actually know where they are. So for example, I have many friends and former colleagues that are in the city of Mariupol, and it's impossible to get any information out of there. So it is very stressful. I think that it enables me, however, to focus my attention on what I can do and what I can control, which I'm grateful for. But yeah, overall, just very, very emotional, and trying to remember to focus on them and their emotional needs and what they're going through. Asking questions only where appropriate. In the very beginning, of course, I was sending 100 messages a day to all of my friends. However, I very quickly realized that, they just don't have the energy to be answering those all of the time. They don't have the energy to be messaging all of the people who are messaging them, even just confirming, that they're alive at the end of the day. So you kind of have to change up your strategy.
Okay, I have a message from Janet. She's asking, is the Ukrainian president allowed by law to appoint a second in command just in case?
Yeah. So to clarify on this point, the Ukrainian government has a kind of a backup scenario very similar to the way that the United States does, where if the United States president were to die, the vice president would then take over. And if the vice president wasn't available, it would keep going down the list. They do have a protocol in place for this. However, it's very unlikely that this would be successful. So when we're talking about military coups in the past, for example, in other countries, it is extremely uncommon for a military to be able to kill or assassinate a president and not whoever the next in command is. So it's not really a realistic option in Ukraine to assume that if Zelensky was assassinated by Russian forces, that a Ukrainian second in command would then be able to take power. If it got to the point where Russian forces were able to assassinate Zelensky, they would have the power in place to put in a new leader of their own.
And then Patricia asked, she said, desperate people do desperate things. What can be done to keep Putin from feeling cornered? What sort of off-ramp might he be offered?
This is a very hot question right now, and I'm sure inside Ukraine as well. There are a few layers to this. So to start with, nothing is going to stop Putin. And I'm so sorry if you hear thumping. That is one of my cats that's locked away right now. The only thing that would stop Putin from genuinely feeling cornered, and frankly, what it really is humiliated. He feels cornered, likely because he feels very humiliated. And the only thing that would really offset that would be allowing him to save face, which at this point is just virtually impossible. It may have been possible very, very early on if there had been a successful negotiated agreement within like the first 3 or 4 days, but at this point, it's just not likely. However, as for an off-ramp, my strong suspicion is that he's being offered off-ramps that are just not considered acceptable to him. So Ukraine is very confident right now and very faithful and very hopeful, and they're not likely to be willing to give in or make any major concessions that would be considered acceptable by him. So for example, in the presentation I mentioned, if the war were to end with Luhansk and Donetsk being seized, that is a possibility, and it is very possible that if there was some sort of signed document confirming that Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk were now Russian territories, that Putin would consider that to be enough. However, I don't see that happening for so many reasons, not the least of which is the fact that the city of Mariupol is in Donetsk, and it is nevertheless being absolutely decimated by Russian forces. So at this point, I think that the stamina that Ukraine has gained and the international attention is very likely to motivate them to fight to the bitter end, so to speak, before they would be willing to give up their territorial integrity. The most common motto that I'm seeing going around Ukraine right now is, in English, it would be "everything will be Ukraine." So it's in other words saying like Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk will all be Ukraine at the end.
I have Gail asked, is the land bridge to Crimea a realistic possibility?
That's a good question. In terms of technology, yes, I do think so. I think it's very, I'm so sorry about that sound. I think it's very likely, not just possible, that if given the opportunity, that he would create a successful land bridge. To clarify, that that wouldn't actually be like dumping sand into the sea to create like a landform. It would just be a bridge similar to bridges that we have, but much longer, that would connect Russia to Crimea. That has been a mission of theirs for a very long time now, more or less since Crimea was first seized. I do think it's a realistic possibility, only if either the current war stalls or if Russia were to win the war and maintain Crimea as one of its territories.
Anne Marie asked, can you recommend specific authors or books to keep learning about Ukrainian history?
I can. So I will specify that I actually don't read a whole lot of books about Ukrainian history because I started out learning about Russian politics and society. Most of the books that I read, I don't want to say that they were from the Russian perspective, but they were Russia focused, largely relating to the Soviet Union. And since then, a lot of what I know about Ukraine, I have learned either from being in Ukraine or studying more like articles or like journals than I would say Ukrainian history. Let me think. There is a book called The White Generals. Now, it's not about Ukraine exclusively. In fact, again, it's Russia focused. And the author is Robert, and I can't remember his last name, but I'm going to type the title in here, The White Generals. It was a very good read, I thought, and it contextualized a lot of the relationship between Ukraine and Russia during the Soviet Union, specifically during the initial takeover, and how the Bolshevik Revolution that occurred when the Red Army of Russia began taking over and annexing other territories. And the white generals were kind of the contrast. So these were the army generals that did not agree with the Red Army, that broke away and came very, very close actually to winning that war, which should have prevented the creation of the Soviet Union in general. It's a very good book. It's the only one I can think of off the top of my head. If I think of any others, I'll type them in the chat as we go.
Okay. And could you just give us like a kind of a little rundown of what you were doing when you were volunteering in Ukraine?
Yeah, absolutely. So there were two main objectives when I was volunteering. One of them, I was working with an organization in Ukraine called Budujemy Ukrainu Razom, which means building Ukraine together. They're a partner organization of Razom for Ukraine, which is the organization that I mentioned earlier. And, oh, thank you, I see. Yes, Richard Luckett, excellent, thank you. So when I was over there, what we started out doing was building houses alongside BOR. It's BUR, BOR is what we call them. And they initially were focused specifically on people who had been impacted by the war in the East. So veterans, for example, who had developed a disability, or people who had taken in orphans of the war. They were rebuilding, or in some cases building, homes for them. It later expanded to be a more like countrywide effort. So it was no longer exclusively for people who had lost their homes in the East. It began moving all over. So I traveled quite a bit all over Ukraine with them, and they hold camps, for lack of a better word, that's what they call it. And it's quite accurate, where people from all over Ukraine, if they apply and they're accepted, they come, and we all would just like live together for 2 weeks really. And I would go over with a bunch of American volunteers, and we would build these structures and also youth community centers together. So that was objective number one. And then number two was partnerships with a school in Konotop and a school in a city called Smila, which is very close to a larger city called Cherkasy that is just smack in the center of Ukraine along the Dnieper River. that goes down through Kiev. And the idea behind that was English-speaking summer camps. So they were looking for volunteers, English-speaking volunteers. So we would match volunteers with these schools and go over there and participate in their English summer camps. They had been pre-existing. We didn't create these summer camps. However, most, if not all, of their volunteers after the beginning of the war in 2014 stopped coming. And so we were just kind of trying to bridge that gap.
And we're out of questions, but if people want to continue to follow what's happening in Ukraine and with Russia, what would you say are some good places to I guess keep up on the news and you feel is kind of like the most accurate and gives the facts kind of as is and it's not biased or tries not to be biased?
Yeah, it's a little bit difficult, of course, to say, because I think at this point most, although they attempt to be unbiased, it's very difficult to even identify what bias is in a situation like that, where we have like war crimes, for example, and if you paint one side in a certain light, even if it's true what they're doing, does it make you biased? I would say the best thing that you can do, number one, is make sure that you are reading news sources who have people who are on the ground, because they're going to have footage that they themselves have filmed that has been geolocated, which means it's been verified that it was in fact taken where they're saying it was taken. And the other thing about that is making sure that you are looking at a wide variety of different, I would say, mainstream news sources. So if you want to be reading, New York Times, CNN, PBS, BBC, and Fox News all at the same time, by all means. They're not all 5 of them going to be correct each time. However, because they are 5 main news stations that all have people on the ground in Ukraine filming, I think it makes it easier to kind of identify, like, okay, what are some people saying? Are there any outliers here that, it might not be quite as true? Is there footage that is representing what it is that they're claiming? I have my own opinions about different news sources, but I will say that I think that keeping up with those 5 as a whole provides a pretty holistic view. And then obviously, if you can access Ukrainian or Russian news sources, the one thing I will say is that Ukrainian Google Translate is absolutely horrible. However, Russian Google Translate is quite good. So if you can find, since Russian is also a very common language in Ukraine, if you can find Ukrainian newspapers that are written in Russian, you can use the Google Translate function to translate them into English and usually get like a pretty legible version of the article.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And I think we're out of questions, so we'll end for the night. But again, thank you so much, Rebecca, for taking your time out of the evening and doing this presentation. I know I learned a lot, and I hope everyone else did as well. And as we're exiting, just a reminder for everyone to do the survey. And again, you can reach out to me or you can reach out to Rebecca and I can send you her information if you are interested in learning more about the organization that she volunteered for and donating to the cause. Okay, thank you everyone so much and have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.